As you all know, the scale of this crisis is unlike anything we've seen. COVID-19 has claimed thousands of lives, including a disproportionate number of African Americans and Latinos. Hundreds of thousands are battling the virus, putting enormous strain on our healthcare system. Millions are out of work. Towns and cities and states are reeling from lost revenue, and minority-owned businesses have encountered too many hurdles when trying to get relief. And so I appreciate various of the items that you raised. And we started to try to address this in March when Congress passed a $2 trillion Coronavirus Response and Economic Security Act, or what we call the CARES Act. This legislation included an unprecedented $377 billion low-cost and forgivable loans for aid for small businesses. As we know, that went too quickly, and there are real issues with how that money was dispersed, to whom it was dispersed, under what circumstances it was dispersed. So, on this new tranche, which I'll talk about shortly, we as Democrats pushed really hard and would not agree to just continuing to add money to the most significant part of that program, the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, unless there were changes to it. Because we heard from too many small businesses, minority businesses in the state, that unless you had a big bank relationship, very difficult to even get lined up to apply for the loan, and that it just quite did not work out for a lot of people. So we wanted a more level playing field. The Paycheck Protection Act, which is now refunded, Congress finished voting it, I think the House voted on it yesterday, was designed to help all types of New Jersey small businesses, from restaurants to retailers to other local businesses, make payroll, pay rent, protect jobs, and ultimately try to respark our recovery. But too many big businesses were able to game the system, and they're being outed. And as a result of it, they're giving back the monies, which we want to plow in back to who it was meant for, which is really small business. Now, when the Republicans wanted to throw another $250 billion at the program and call it a day, we demanded that there be provisions that more money flow to small businesses most in need. So on top of the $250 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, we secured an additional $110 billion. That includes $60 billion for small lenders, community-based financial institutions, CDFIs that work with the underbanked and unserved small businesses and nonprofits. Of that, the $30 billion of those $60 billion will assist CDFI, community development financial institutions, minority deposit institutions, community-focused lending intermediaries, and the smallest community banks and credit unions. So we think that that's incredibly important to create a more level playing field. And the other thing that we pushed really hard in this latest legislation that passed, in addition, of course, helping our hospitals, which are desperately in need of our help and are at the front line of meeting the challenges of COVID-19, is the question of testing. You know, the nation's wealth and our collective wealth will only rise when the nation's health gets better. And at the end of the day, unless we can have large-scale testing that almost become universal and is cost-free for those who have insurance, fine, a mandatory requirement that coverage be included for it. For those who do not, that ultimately they can get it equally available and paid for. That's why we pushed really hard and added to this package before we agreed to it $25 billion for testing, which we think is incredibly important. And we are pushing for that within that $25 billion to make sure that communities of color have access to that type of testing so that they can get equal access as well. That's where we're at in terms of what happened. And I'll only add one other thing. We know, I've heard from Governor Murphy, he's my new best friend, because he's spending a lot of time calling me, telling me of the challenges the state has, and I truly respect a lot of the tough decisions he's had to make. None of us want to close down a business. None of us want to keep ourselves distant from family. It's heart-wrenching when I have to say hello to my granddaughters, from a window or 6 feet away. But at the end of the day, it's the only way we starve off the virus. And we can either be part of the solution or part of the statistics. But that means there's a lot of loss of state revenue. So I have joined with a Republican, Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, for legislation that would give $500 billion to the states, divided in 3 different tranches. One as general assistance to the states, a third of it based on population, a third of it for the hardest hit states with COVID-19. And unfortunately, this is not a category I wish we were high up in, but we are number 2 in the nation in terms of the number of cases. We've hit over 100,000 and deaths. And so, that would be a big category for us. And the third is those who have the greatest revenue loss. So we believe that legislation, which I'm looking forward in a COVID-4, a large package, will ultimately be able to help the state meet some of the core challenges it has to all of us as New Jersey citizens. So with that introductory remark, let me just briefly go through some slides to talk about some of these different programs and answer 1 or 2 questions before I have to go on to a next conference. But so how does the $2 trillion economic stimulus help New Jersey? Well, direct payments of up to 80% of New Jersey families, and those who had direct deposits should be seeing those direct deposits being made into their accounts. If not, it'll take more time. Unfortunately, Treasury is saying we're pushing them hard, but for checks to ultimately be sent. And unemployment insurance expansion, which is one of the things that Democrats fought for, as well as a more robust direct payment, and then aid for small businesses. Next slide. This is how it helps workers and families. Next slide. How much does somebody get? I think most people know this already, but it's worth going through it again. A individual tax filer with an adjusted gross income of up to $75,000 and a head of household filer with an adjusted gross income of up to $112,500 should receive $1,200. Joint filers with an adjusted gross income of up to $150,000 should receive twice as much, about $2,400. If you're over those amounts, over the $75,000 as a head of household filer or a joint filer with $150,000, you still get money, but it gets reduced at $5 for every $100 you're over that amount. And if you have children under the age of 17 who you claim as a dependent, you should get an additional $500. When do I get my checks? As I mentioned earlier, for those who, when they file their tax returns, ultimately gave a direct deposit information to the IRS, then you should have been seeing, starting this week that we're in, that we're finishing up, direct deposit made until next week. And those who are not have a direct deposit or we're going to wait for a check, Treasury is saying that's going to take a couple months. I don't know why, and we're pushing them hard because people need their money now. Next slide. Unemployment insurance. So for those who in your families and others who you may know, the maximum benefit in New Jersey is up to $713, 26 weeks, but the CARES Act extended that for an additional 13 weeks. And if someone already exhausted their 26 weeks, let's say they were on unemployment before the pandemic hit, they still are eligible for the extra 13 weeks and apply with the New Jersey Department of Labor and Workforce Development. Next slide. In addition to that baseline, before I go to these numbers, you'll get whatever is, it's about 60% of whatever your income was as your unemployment baseline up to that amount that I mentioned. But until July 1st, if someone's still unemployed, and of course, if you're offered employment, you have to go back to work. But if you're not offered employment and you're still unemployed, in addition to whatever the baseline you would have gotten in Social Security, whatever the baseline you would have gotten in unemployment compensation, then there will be an additional $600 per week until July 1st. And that's to help families get through this difficult period of time. Of course, to apply for unemployment, you can go to myunemployment.nj.gov, and there are on the screen are several numbers for Northern, Central, and Southern New Jersey. Next slide. Small and mid-sized businesses, next slide. It's still worth talking about the Paycheck Protection Act because since another $250 billion was put into it and some adjustments were made to it, plus money that's being recouped from large corporations that should not have been part of the access to the money, we should go over the provisions of the act so people can be lined up if they desire to apply. And that law, basically the CARES Act, broke down between the Paycheck Protection Act, the Emergency Economic Injury Grants, debt relief for those who have existing SBA loans, and paid leave for government contractors and resources for business counseling services. Next slide. This is a side-by-side between the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. In the PPP, any business, small business, which is 500, determined to be 500 or less, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, a 501c19 veterans organization that had fewer than 500 employees or less, can borrow up to $10 million in loan, part of which would be forgiven if it's used towards payrolls, utilities, rent, and I believe also another category is mortgage interest, not mortgage payments, but mortgage interest. The EIDL is a $10,000 grant that can be used for paid sick leave to employees, maintaining the payroll. Those of you who produce a product, if you're getting increased costs due to obtaining materials, that can be used for that. Rent payments and other similar payments. Now, the PPP program, the Small Business Administration, I know many of you already know this, you don't go directly to SBA, you go to an SBA approved lender. This is where we found difficulties, particularly with the minority community. That's why we changed some of this as it relates to who can be an approved lender. But to find out who are those approved lenders that you can apply to, you can go to sba.gov /paycheck protection /find, and they will have a list of all SBA approved lenders. And for the economic injury disaster loan on the other side of that screen on your right side, that you do go directly to the SBA. It's COVID-19 relief.sba.gov, COVID-19 relief.sba.gov. And the one caveat I would say about this is you can't use the economic emergency disaster loan for the same purpose as the PPP loan. So you can't get two bites at the apple. But if you're using it for one set of purposes, covering certain employees for a certain period of time under the EIDL, and then covering other employees under the PPP, that's okay. But you can't get the same thing twice. Next slide. Now, these are the newest funds, what we call CV 3.5, which passed the Senate on April 21st, provides an additional $310 billion to the Paycheck Protection Act, of which $60 billion, as I mentioned earlier in my prefatory remarks, is set aside for smaller and community-oriented lenders to make these loans. $30 billion for loans made by small lenders with between 10 and 50 billion in assets, $30 billion for loans made by CDFIs, small insured depository institutions and credit unions with assets less than 10 billion. Additionally, the bill provides an additional $50 billion more in economic injury disaster loans, the EIDL loans, and 10 billion more in EIDL grants. So those EIDL loans and grants, that's a great place for a lot of small businesses to get some immediate relief. The PPP, obviously, depending upon what you use it for, let's say you took $1 million and $500,000 went to your employee payroll, and rent and other acceptable, forgivable amounts, that $500,000 would then be forgiven. You'd be left with a $500,000 balance. New slide, please. Now, for those, we all aspire to be over this, but just in case, you never know. On those who have employees above 500 and up to 10,000 employees, or who have up to 2.5 billion in 2019 revenues, the Federal Reserve, along with the Secretary of the Treasury, announced the Main Street Lending Program. There's a total of 600 billion in loans available there. They have a term of up to 4 years. They'll defer principal and interest repayment for 1 year of those 4 years. They'll be required to attest to meet certain requirements regarding both need and eligibility. The borrower has to abide also by certain restrictions during the term of the loan, which we insisted on. One is to make a reasonable effort to maintain payroll and retain employees. Limitations on executive compensation. In 2008, during the financial crisis, we saw a lot of money used with institutions that ultimately gave large executive compensation. There are strict limitations on that. There can be no stock buybacks or dividends unless they were previously contractually obligated to do. New slide. Now, even though we know the Chamber of Commerce is focused on the business of business, we also know you're a community leader, so I'm just going to go through 1 or 2 slides when people need specific assistance. The Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, contained work, something I oppose, but for related eligibility requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents who work less than 80 hours per month. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is one of the first pieces of legislation, partially suspends this time limit nationwide during the period of the emergency declaration. So, obviously when we're all being told to stay in and you can't find work, well, insisting that you got to have work requirements to get SNAP benefits just didn't seem right. So those are suspended during this time period. Next slide. The CARES Act also included another 15.5 billion for SNAP participants should it exceed the previous budget estimates that we had for SNAP. And there's also a $450 million for the Emergency Food Assistance Program, which is a federal program that supplements the diets of low-income Americans by providing them with emergency food assistance packages that are distributed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to states, and the participants get it at their local food banks. So that was upped as well. Next slide. On Medicaid, we have this slide in here because obviously one of the ways in which many people of color got health care was through Medicaid expansion under the Obamacare. So we're going to briefly just talk about Medicaid here. Next slide. Obviously, COVID-19, as we have seen, this deadly virus is of particular concern for vulnerable populations who may rely on Medicaid. We increased the federal Medicaid assistance percentage, which is the federal share of the Medicaid program, by a little over 6% for every qualifying state through the public health emergency. And we will continue fighting for more money for all healthcare programs in any future package. But this was particularly important to give a shot at the eyes of those who are providing Medicaid covered provider assistance to our families during this period of time to make sure that they continue doing so. Next slide. And so on all of these questions, I would just simply say, I've only touched the surface of what the CARES Act and the new CV 3.5 covered. But if you have more profound questions, a lot of it will be covered on our website, on our webpage, menendez.senate.gov/coronavirus, and under the coronavirus section of Menendez. We have the whole small business, all about the Paycheck Protection Act, all contacts necessary, and a wide variety of other information on our hospitals, on healthcare, and a whole host of information. It's a great go-to place. So, John, I think that we got submitted a couple of questions.
Yes.
And
I do have one question, Senator, that might be on the hearts and minds of the listeners, and we want to applaud you again for joining us today. And I think all the information you shared is so important. You know, you talk about the blood and treasure that has been expended in terms of loss of lives for Blacks and Hispanics in the state of New Jersey and around the state. And the irony is, even in good times, we did not, in my opinion, get our equitable share of capital and or opportunity. So liquidity is so important, access to opportunity and anticipating this new normal. So my question is, there's going to be $1.5 to $2 billion earmarked for the state of New Jersey coming from the federal government. And if you can share with our viewers how that might be appropriated, that might be, you know, something that they really should know in anticipating some other potential forms of relief to the state.
Yes, well, the monies under the CARES Act that were given to the states is primarily a revenue to the state to use to offset what were in essence emergent expenditures. So you had the state police going ahead and building temporary hospitals in the Meadowlands in central Jersey and southern New Jersey. You had the state buying large amounts of personal protective gear and other things that they needed that they would not have. So it goes primarily, so it's revenue to the state that replaces revenue that they lost. And then, of course, as Governor Murphy has made a very clear and compelling case, along with all the other governors of the National Governors Association, who have asked for $500 billion collectively, their position is, look, we had to take strict social distancing measures that included closing the great majority of businesses. As such, the state is losing enormous amounts of revenue that it cannot expect to recoup. And unless we get some help with the revenue, all those things that we do every day as a state government on behalf of its people, we will not be able to do without some consequence, meaning cuts, education, healthcare workers, whatever else the state has. So to a large degree, those funds seems to be the funds that are essential to the state to be able to function again when all things are normal. But the state will have, as it always has in its discretion, how it will use the resources it receives from the federal government for other purposes. Now, separate and apart from those general revenue funds, there were some specific set-asides, which I didn't touch here, but you can go to menendez.senate.gov/coronavirus, and you'll see the state receives some special funds on education. The state receives some special funds for childcare elements. The state received, as well as certain counties and entities over a certain population, receive additional CDBG funds. Those, however, are more program directed, and except for CDBG, where as long as you spend it within overall CDBG purposes, what you do with that money is the discretion of the recipient. So those are the places that I would make my advocacy with in terms of any needs that you're thinking about for the community.
Mhm. So you have some other questions that came from the audience?
Yeah, we have some other questions that came, and let me just deal with two of them. I mean, we're happy to answer questions as we go. And by the way, John, for all of those who are viewing, Kasim Gomez in our Newark office is an outreach on all of these things. Erica Calderon in Washington deals with the small business PPP programs, and of course, Kasim works with her. So two names that, although our people are not physically in the office, they're all working remotely, and they have their phones on and their access to their emails and our responses. So anybody who has specific questions can follow up with that. One of the questions that was sent to me is can there be a set aside portion of the funding that can go specifically to minority owned companies? Well, while the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and Healthcare Enhancement Act didn't set aside specific funding for minority owned small businesses, what we did do in this last tranche, as I mentioned earlier, is make sure that those who are more likely to be lenders to the minority community have a specific set aside. So $30 billion to be made to smaller lenders, including minority depositors, institutions, as well as community development financial institutions. I know many have worked with them. We have a couple in New Jersey that are excellent. And also, there's also some $10 million in grants to minority business development, and minority chambers of commerce. So that's something to be looked at as well. The second question, many applications for funds were submitted before the funds ran out. Will they get priority with the second round of funding? Well, the SBA did not accept any PPP applications from any lender since the program ran out of funding. So I really think, I've told several businesses that have called me who do have a corresponding relationship with a financial institution, let's say a bank, that they need to get on the horn with their banker and say, look, I need to be up there on the list, because as those institutions submit, obviously, if you're number 1 to 10 on the list, you got a lot better shot than if you're number 100 on the list. So this is where the specific set aside to minority lending institutions is so important, to make sure that individuals from our communities have the shot to be up there, number 1 to 10 instead of number 100.
Mm-hmm. I think you raised some good points, particularly as it relates to the CBG money. That's why I talked earlier about the Title VI and greater accountability, because that money's come right into many of the urban cities, and how the mayors of those communities leverage those resources to really help and support the businesses of those communities. And the airport gets federal dollars. Hopefully we'll get this tunnel project up and running, but there's a lot of federal resources that come into the state for infrastructure and related projects. And Senator, our folks are still not even an appetizer. And so this is why I'm really urging you and your team, if we can get some strategies around, Title VI is a very powerful law. If we could get some sanctions and some greater accountability, and also transparency of how these dollars are appropriated, who's getting the contracts. Because even in a good environment, Black businesses are struggling. And so this COVID-19 situation is devastating. Our concern is what will be the percentages of the businesses that are able to restart And we're very concerned that we're going to lose a lot of businesses, as we've already lost a lot of lives. So we're here to work in partnership with you. There's some great people within your office. They're very responsive, and we really appreciate that. And it appears that they take our concerns to heart. But if we can get a strategy immediately following the day and get some targets, some specific things that we could work together on and report back out to our folks, I think that'd be much appreciated.
Well, John, we're happy to do that, as we've had in the past. Obviously, you know, how would I say it? You know, who governs has consequences at the end of the day. And so the only reason we even got the 60 billion set aside in the way that I described earlier was because we just wouldn't give them the votes, because originally all they wanted was 250 billion for the PPP as it was. Well, that didn't work out for a lot of our people. So, but we also need obviously coordination with the state, because some of these funds are definitely going to flow through the state. So we'll get Governor Murphy's ear when he calls me one of the next times he calls, and I'll tell him the conversation that we had. But you know, I'm very much engaged in making sure that the backbone, the economic vertebrae of our communities, which are small businesses, have not just a fighting chance, but a great chance in the future. I've had this discussion to some degree with the chairman of the Port Authority, you know, who I've said, I know you give me a list of everything you want from the federal government, but we need to make sure that more of our people actually end up with the benefits of the results that I bring home from Washington. And we're going to hold you accountable. And I know that many of people have asked me, are you going to hold the financial institutions accountable who are giving out this money? Absolutely. One of the things that we did is insist that before we agree to all this money, that there is an inspector general just for this program. And my colleagues in the Senate who are involved on the Small Business Committee, I sit on the Finance Committee, I sit on the Banking Committee. We're letting financial institutions know we're going to look at how you ultimately determine to lend money. We're going to look at who you lent it to. We're telling them this as a way that I hope will be preventive, although we've already seen some excesses, and that will be consequential if they didn't heed that there is going to be rigorous oversight. And that's the best way that we can ultimately ensure that we do what is necessary to make sure that the program gets to who it was intended to be.
No, we know you as a strong advocate, and we take you at your word. I did want you to know that we are working with the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, and that we're seeing questions about people looking to apply for the PPP or the EIDL loan, and they can call our office, 609-571-1620. We'll be glad to help them. But also, we see mergers taking place in New Jersey from federally chartered banks like Ocean First and Provident, who has a merger pending. So your word to these banks that the CRA and access to capital is very important to you and to all of us. And so we're seeing, you know, the satisfactory and outstanding ratings from the CRA perspective somewhat being granted very generously. So any look into that stuff would be greatly appreciated.
We will, and we're trying to let them know that just because we're not in Washington holding hearings, doesn't mean that they're going to get away with saying that because of this time frame, there aren't those who are watching, asking questions, and pressing the issue, and we'll continue to do that.
No,
thank you again for the opportunity, and stay well.
Thank you, sir, and all the blessings to you and your family as well. And we're here to partner with you in any way we can.
Absolutely. Look forward.
Thank you, Senator.